in our last section of the chapter, we're going to talk about life, because biology technically is the study of life. So now that we've talked a little bit about scientific method and tools used in science and all of that, let's actually start getting into the biology, which is the study of living things. So in order to do that, we need to define life. So biology is the study of life, and we are going to start with a definition, a working definition of what life is. Now, some things people assume are characteristics of living things, and if I call out, hey, name some characteristics that all living things have, these are some of the things that people come up with. All living things can move. All living things need oxygen. All living things reproduce, have offspring. All living things use energy. But actually, not all of these are characteristics of every living thing. For example, bacteria don't move. They're living things, but that's not true. Some of them can move, but some bacteria do not have a method of moving. They just sort of float around. So they're not moving. Or plants, when you think about it, I mean, they grow in place, but they're certainly not moving from place to place. They can't walk around. Breathing oxygen, most living things need oxygen. Plants, animals, funguses typically, but actually, for example, yeast can live without oxygen present. Certain bacteria are actually killed by oxygen. They're called anaerobic bacteria, and oxygen is actually toxic to them. So that's an assumption that's not necessarily true. Now, all living things do reproduce. That is a characteristic, but not necessarily by making babies sexually with a male and a female. Plants, for example, some plants have pollen, which is sort of like sperm, and eggs, and so in a way they do reproduce sexually like we do. There's not necessarily male and female plants. On the other hand, some organisms can actually reproduce asexually. For example, there's a little organism that looks kind of like an upside down jellyfish called a hydra, and it can reproduce by what's called budding, where basically a clone grows off the side and breaks off. And there's several organisms that can reproduce this way. And bacteria only reproduce asexually. One bacteria will just divide and become two. So there's not male and female bacteria mating with one another or anything like that. Using energy is a characteristic all living things have. We call that metabolism. So we're going to go through and actually go one by one through the characteristics that all living things do share. Oh, and here's another one, taking in food. This technically is a characteristic, although you might think, well, plants make their own food by photosynthesis, but they do take in nutrients from the soil, like nitrogen and things like that. And you might think of the plants like the Venus flytrap. They actually, even though they do photosynthesis, they get all their nutrients by eating. So taking in food is something that living things can do as part of the metabolism process. So the first characteristic is that living things are organized, meaning they are simple chemicals. We're made of very simple things. Carbon, one way to remember it is CHOMPS. Carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur. These are the most common ones. A lot of times you'll just hear these first four, CHON. Remember, you've probably heard that we're like 60 to 70% water. Well, water is H2O. So we're made out of quite a bit of hydrogen and oxygen. And proteins and carbohydrates and fats and all of those all contain carbon and hydrogen and oxygen. So we're made out of very simple elements, but they're organized in a very complicated way. No one in a lab has ever been able to just build a human with a pile of carbon and hydrogen and oxygen. We're too complicated. We are organized into levels. The smallest level, and these are levels that you should know, is the chemical level. We're going to walk through these in a second. So this would be like atoms and molecules. We're all made of atoms and molecules. Those are organized into organelles, which are parts of cells. Cells can be organized into tissues and organs, then organ systems, and then you get entire multicellular organisms. And then we have these levels above the organism: population, which is a group of the same species, a community, an ecosystem, and then all life on Earth is the biosphere, just everywhere on Earth where life can exist. We're also classified into levels. We're not going to talk about this for the test. This is something we're going to do later in the year. But every living thing belongs to a domain. There's 3 domains. And then those domains are split into kingdoms. For example, I'm sure everybody knows the animal kingdom, And there's also the plant kingdom, and there's the fungi kingdom, and there are other kingdoms. And then those are subdivided into phyla, classes, orders, families, and then we all have a special genus species name. For humans, it's Homo sapiens. That's our genus and our species, which makes up our scientific name. So this classification part, we're going to learn about this later in the year. It's not going to be on your test, but you do need to know these levels. So let's go through them in a little more detail. So this picture kind of shows all of those levels. So the chemical level is atoms and molecules. When those are put together in a special way, you get organelles, which are cell parts. For example, you've probably heard of ribosomes or mitochondria, or maybe you learned about the Golgi bodies or the rough and smooth ER. Those are organelles. When you put those together, you get cells. Cells are considered the smallest living thing. Nothing alive exists below the level of cell. So a mitochondria, for example, can't live on its own. That's a part of a cell, but on its own it cannot survive. So the smallest living thing, make sure you know that for the test as well, is a cell. And there are some organisms that are made of just single cells, like bacteria and protists, like amoeba and little pond organisms like that. A tissue is a group of cells working together. For example, muscle tissue is a type of tissue, which consists of several muscle cells all contracting together. So when you're lifting something heavy, you're not just using one muscle cell, you're using hundreds or thousands of muscle cells all working together. An organ is multiple tissues. So for example, your heart is an organ, and your heart consists of muscle tissue, nerve tissue, which stimulates it to pump. It also consists of epithelial tissue, which is a coating around it that protects it. So there's lots of tissues that compose each of your organs. And then your organs make up an organ system, like your circulatory system, which is your heart, plus your arteries, your veins, your capillaries, etc. And then you put that together and you get an organism. Now, just to clarify, a multicellular organism would have all of these parts. A single-celled organism would just be a single cell. And this could survive on its own, but the cells in a multicellular organism can't, interestingly. Because, for example, if you just took a muscle cell out of your body, you're like, okay, but it's a cell and that's the smallest life. Yes, but once it's part of a multicellular organism, we have what's called a division of labor among our cells, meaning our cells depend on each other because they're part of a multicellular organism. So if you take one of those cells and put it by itself, it can't survive on its own. Whereas a simple cell organism like a bacterium or a paramecium or an amoeba, they have everything they need to survive on their own. But they're not nearly as complicated as we are, and they can't do all the cool things that we can do. So single-celled organisms are very, very simple, whereas multicellular organisms can do a lot more. We're much more complex. Okay, a population is a group of a single species in an area. So if we went to a lake and we just counted all the bass, which is a type of fish, that would be a population. Or if you went to the forest and just counted all the deer in the forest, that would be a population of deer. Or you could also have a population of pine trees, but it would be a single species in one area. A community is all the living things in the area. So in a lake, that would be all the different species of fish, plus the plants, plus the ducks, plus the bacteria that live in the lake, plus the amoebas that live in the lake. Every living thing in the lake would be part of that lake community. Now, an ecosystem is the community. We're sort of backing up bigger and bigger. It's the community, but then add in the non-living things. Another word for that is abiotic. Biotic means living, and when you put an A in front, now it is non-living. So this would be every living thing in the lake, but also the soil in the lake, the water in the lake, the minerals in the lake, the oxygen in the lake. Every non-living thing that's also part of that would be an ecosystem. And then the biosphere is basically all life on Earth. So it's the entirety of the Earth where life can exist, all of the ecosystems and communities and everything else. So this is how living things are organized from smallest to largest. These are the kingdoms. Again, this is not on the test. We're going to learn about the different kingdoms later on in the year, but bacteria, archaea, which is a unique kind of bacteria, plants, protists, which there's a lot of discussion of subdividing those, fungi and animals. So these are all different kingdoms with unique characteristics. All right, the rest of these go pretty quick. All living things are made of cells. Many living things are multicellular. This is a picture of a multicellular organism. We're going to actually look at the cells of this organism under the microscope in class in a couple of weeks. Next, all living things grow and develop. And I just included some pictures of growth and development. So, the chick hatches and then it becomes an adult. Mushrooms and plants sprout. Butterflies go through an entire metamorphosis. So we're born, we grow, but we don't just get bigger. We develop and change. If you think about what you look like now, you don't look like the same as you did as a baby, but bigger. You've changed, so you grow and develop. Metabolize. Make sure you know this word. This means that we all use energy. Most life, energy comes to us from the sun. Now, we cannot absorb the sun's energy directly. I mean, you can lay in the sun, but you're not going to make your own food like plants do. So through photosynthesis, the plants can absorb the energy from the sun. And then through what's called cell respiration, which we'll learn about, we can convert the sugar that the plants have stored all that energy as. They store it as sugar, and then we can convert it, release that energy and convert it to a chemical messenger in our bodies called ATP. And we'll talk about that in another chapter. But every living thing metabolizes. Respond. All living things respond to their environments in some way. They don't all respond the same way. And that's called maintaining homeostasis. So in this picture, you can see the plants are responding to light. They will actually bend towards the light. It does take a little bit of time, but it's called phototropism. Even little single-celled organisms in ponds, some of them will swim towards light sources. They have sensors, and they can do that. You can also think of our reaction. When you get too hot, what do? You sweat. That's your body's reaction to cool you down. You sweat, the sweat evaporates, your body cools down. When you're cold, you shiver. What does shivering do? It contracts your muscles, which generates heat. So your brain sets up a situation where you maintain homeostasis. And that's just one example. We also maintain blood sugar balance, water balance, blood pressure balance. There's all kinds of things going on in our body to maintain homeostasis. And this is true for every living thing. They have to maintain a balance of the amount of water and the amount of salts and their temperature. And they've got to do that in some way. So every living thing responds in some way to the environment. All living things reproduce in the sense that we have DNA. Every living thing has DNA, and we pass that on. It's a universal code. It's instructions for building a new living thing, and we pass that from parent to offspring. Even when it's asexual reproduction, which is a single parent, like bacteria splitting, they're still giving each new one a copy of that DNA. And finally, living things evolve. Now, as an individual, you don't necessarily evolve in this biological sense, but groups can change over time. What happens is every time sexual reproduction happens, you get a new combination of DNA. Nobody looks, other than an identical twin, you don't look exactly like anybody else. And so everybody's got unique characteristics. And sometimes in nature, those characteristics could give you a benefit that would then allow you to survive better when there's competition for food and shelter and all that kind of stuff. And if you survive better, you're going to pass that combination of DNA on. Also, mutations can happen. We know that there's mutations, which we think of as bad, but mutations can be good. They can give us a new DNA trait that actually helps us survive. And that's called natural selection or survival of the fittest, when certain traits may become more common over many generations because they're beneficial to the organism. For example, you don't see a lot of white tigers in the wild. They don't survive as well. They don't blend with their environment as well. And so even though we see them in the zoo, when that mutation arises, it probably doesn't stick around because it's not favorable for survival. On the other hand, look at these moths. You can barely even see this one. As you can imagine, this one's going to be more protected from birds. And so it's probably not surprising to you that in this particular environment, most of the moths are going to look like this one that's almost invisible. Less are going to look like this because they're going to be more likely to be seen and eaten. Therefore, they're not going to pass on those genes to their offspring. So this is just a summary of everything. I'm going to run out of time here, but you can see all of the characteristics. So keep in mind, like a virus, for example, is not alive. It's not made of cells. Viruses don't metabolize. They don't respond. They're just a set of instructions that's passed along. And so not everything you would think is alive necessarily is.